We've already transferred everything into our names, Mom. It's just easier this way, my son Daniel said, as if he were talking about switching a phone plan and not dismantling my entire life. I remember the way the overhead light reflected off the polished oak table, the same table I had spent 25 years wiping down after family dinners, birthday cakes, and Sunday mornings with too much coffee and not enough time. I looked at him, really looked, searching for something familiar in his face, some trace of the boy who used to run to me after school with grass stains on his jeans and stories he couldn't wait to tell. But all I saw was distance. And next to him, Vanessa sat perfectly still, her fingers wrapped neatly around a glass of water, her lips curved in a small, polite smile that never reached her eyes. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to, because in that moment, something inside me went quiet. Not broken, just quiet. The house is under our name now, he continued, glancing briefly at Vanessa before looking back at me. And the car. The bank account too. It's just simpler for taxes and planning. Simpler. I nodded once, slowly, as if I were agreeing to something reasonable, as if I had been part of this decision. The silence that followed stretched longer than it should have. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the ticking clock on the wall I had bought at a flea market 15 years ago, the soft clink of Vanessa setting her glass down with deliberate care. No one said anything else. Dinner ended like that, quietly. The next morning, I woke up to a house that no longer felt like mine. My slippers were still by the bed. My robe still hung on the back of the door. But something had shifted. I walked downstairs and found 2 cardboard boxes sitting neatly by the hallway. My name wasn't on them, but I knew they were mine. Inside were small things. My photo albums. A few books. The ceramic bowl my husband had given me on our 30th anniversary. Not everything. Just enough to make space. I stood there for a long moment, my hand resting on the edge of one box, feeling the rough texture of the cardboard against my skin. No one had told me to leave. Not yet. But I understood. Later that afternoon, Vanessa passed by me in the kitchen, her voice light, almost cheerful. "We thought it might be easier if you moved into the guest room for now," she said, as if she were offering me a kindness. I smiled. Not because I agreed, but because I finally saw it clearly. I had spent years believing I was part of this home. But I wasn't. Not anymore. And the strangest part was, I didn't feel the urge to fight. Not then. Because somewhere deep inside, beneath the silence, something else had begun to stir. Something patient. Something they hadn't accounted for. I moved into the guest room that same evening without being asked twice, carrying only what I could hold in my arms, leaving behind drawers half full and closets that no longer felt like they belonged to me. And as I set my things down on the narrow bed, I noticed how unfamiliar everything felt, not because the room was new, but because I had never truly lived in it. It had always been a space for others, temporary, forgettable, just like I was becoming. And yet I said nothing. I simply folded my clothes, placed my shoes neatly by the wall, and sat down for a moment, listening to the quiet that followed me wherever I went now. A quiet that was different from the kind I used to enjoy in the early mornings with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. This quiet had weight. It pressed against my chest in a way that made even breathing feel deliberate. Downstairs I could hear Vanessa moving through the kitchen, the soft clatter of dishes, the low hum of her voice as she spoke on the phone. And I wondered briefly who she was talking to, what version of this story she was telling, because I had a feeling it did not include the woman upstairs who had once owned every corner of this house. Later that night, Daniel knocked once on the door before opening it halfway. He did not step inside. He just stood there, one hand on the frame, as if crossing the threshold required more effort than he was willing to give. "I hope you are comfortable," he said, his voice careful, measured the way people speak when they are trying to avoid saying what they really mean. I nodded, offering him the same polite smile I had learned to wear, the kind that keeps conversations short and questions away. He lingered for a second, as if there was something else he wanted to say, something buried beneath the surface, but then he simply gave a small nod and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hallway that used to echo with laughter. I lay down that night staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the paint with my eyes, remembering a time when I used to plan renovations, when I cared about the color of the walls, the placement of furniture, the small details that made a house feel like a home. But those thoughts felt distant now, like memories from someone else's life. The next morning I woke early out of habit, my body still following a routine that no longer had a place here. I made my way to the kitchen only to pause in the doorway. Vanessa stood at the counter, her back to me, scrolling through her phone. She did not turn around when she spoke. We reorganized the pantry last night, so just let me know if you cannot find anything. Her tone was light, almost helpful, but there was something underneath it, something that made it clear this was no longer my kitchen. I murmured a quiet thank you and reached for a mug, only to realize the one I always used was gone, replaced by a new set, identical and impersonal. I chose one at random and poured myself a cup of coffee, standing there for a moment as the familiar smell filled the air, grounding me in a way nothing else could. I took a sip and set the mug down gently, careful not to leave a mark, careful not to take up too much space, because that was what I was learning now, slowly, quietly, that in a house I had once built with my own hands, I was now just a guest, and guests do not overstep, they do not question, they do not stay forever. And as that realization settled in, I felt that same quiet shift inside me again. Stronger this time, steadier, like something waiting for the right moment to rise. By the third day, I understood the pattern, not because anyone explained it to me, but because of the small things, the quiet changes that spoke louder than any words ever could. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room. The way Vanessa would lower her voice just enough to make it clear that I was no longer part of what was being said. The way Daniel avoided eye contact, choosing instead to look at his phone, at the floor, at anything but me. And it was not dramatic, it was not loud, it was subtle, careful, almost polite, which somehow made it worse, because it left no space to argue, no clear moment to push back against, just a slow, steady erasure that happened right in front of me. One morning I noticed that the hallway closet had been reorganized. My coats were gone, replaced with Vanessa's neatly arranged jackets, color-coordinated, perfectly spaced, as if they had always been there. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering where my favorite wool coat used to hang, the one I wore every winter for nearly a decade, and I tried to remember when I had last seen it, but the memory slipped away from me, like so many things lately. Later that afternoon, I found Daniel in the living room, scrolling through something on his laptop. I stood by the doorway for a second before speaking. "Have you seen my coat?" I asked, keeping my voice even. Calm. He looked up briefly, confusion flickering across his face before it settled into something more distant. "I think Vanessa donated some old things last weekend," he said, as if that explained everything, as if my belongings had simply become old things without anyone thinking to ask me. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to say anything else, because I realized then that this was not about a coat. It was about something much bigger, something that had been building quietly for a long time, something I had chosen not to see. That evening I sat in the guest room, the small lamp casting a soft yellow light against the walls, and I let my mind drift back, not to the pain of now, but to the years that came before, to the time when this house was filled with plans and laughter, when Daniel would sit at this very table and tell me about his dreams, when I believed that everything we were building would last, that it would protect us, that it would mean something. But now, sitting there with only a fraction of my life around me, I began to understand that what I had built was never really mine in the way I thought it was. I had poured myself into this family, into this home, into a future that no longer included me, and yet, even as that realization settled in, I did not feel anger, not yet. I felt something quieter, something colder, a kind of clarity that comes when there is nothing left to lose. And as I sat there, listening to the faint sounds of the house that no longer belonged to me, I realized that they believed they had taken everything that mattered. They believed that by controlling the house, the money, the decisions, they had secured their future, and perhaps they had, in their own minds. But what they did not see, what they had never bothered to ask about, was the part of my life that existed long before this house, long before Daniel was even born. The part that came from my father, from a time when I was not just someone's mother or someone's burden, but someone who had her own name, her own history. And as that thought settled in, I felt that quiet shift again, stronger now, steadier, no longer just a feeling, but the beginning of something else entirely. It was not one single memory that came back to me that night, but a series of small, quiet moments that I had once thought were ordinary, moments that now felt heavier, as if they had been trying to tell me something all along. I remembered the first time Vanessa had suggested changing the layout of the living room, how she had smiled and said it would make the space feel more modern, more efficient, and I had agreed without hesitation, because it seemed like such a small thing, just furniture, just decoration. But after that came other suggestions, the kind that sounded reasonable on the surface, updating the joint accounts for convenience, consolidating bills to make things easier to manage, even adding her name to certain documents so she could help out when needed. And each time I nodded, each time I signed where they told me to sign, trusting that family meant something solid, something that did not need to be questioned. I remember Daniel reassuring me, his voice gentle, patient, the way it used to be when he explained something to me years ago. It is just paperwork, Mom, nothing changes. And I believed him, because I wanted to believe him, because it was easier to see my son as the boy I had raised than the man he had become. And now, sitting there in that small guest room, I began to see the pattern clearly, not as a series of isolated decisions, but as a slow and careful shift, a transition that had been happening long before I ever noticed. I thought about my husband then, about the way he used to handle things, the quiet confidence he carried when it came to protecting what we had built together. I could almost hear his voice in my memory, telling me to be careful, to read everything twice, to never assume that kindness would be returned simply because it was given. But he had been gone for years now, and in his absence, I had filled the silence with trust, with the belief that family would carry the same sense of responsibility he once did. I stood up and walked over to the small dresser in the corner of the guest room, opening the top drawer where I had placed a few of my things. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of folded sweaters, was an old envelope, worn at the edges, its paper slightly yellowed with time. I had not thought about it in years, not really. It was something my father had given me long ago, something I had kept out of habit more than anything else. I picked it up slowly, running my fingers over the familiar handwriting on the front, my name written in his careful, steady script, and for a moment, I just stood there, holding it, feeling the weight of something I had not fully considered until now. I remembered the day he gave it to me, standing on the porch of that old farm, the air warm and still, the fields stretching out behind him. He had told me it was important, that it was mine no matter what happened, and I had smiled, thanked him, and tucked it away without asking too many questions, because at the time, my life was here in this house, with my husband, with my son. I had not imagined a future where I would need anything else. But now, as I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the documents inside, I felt that quiet shift inside me settle into something more solid, more defined, because for the first time since that dinner, since the moment everything changed, I was not looking at what I had lost. I was looking at something they had never touched, something they had never even asked about. And as I read through the familiar lines, I realized that while they had been busy taking everything they thought mattered, they had overlooked the one thing that had always belonged to me, something older than this house, older than the life I built here, something that had been waiting quietly, just like I had, for the moment it would finally matter. The paper felt heavier than it should have as I sat down on the edge of the bed, the faint rustle of it breaking the silence that had become so familiar, and I read every line slowly, carefully, not because I did not understand it, but because I needed to be certain that I had not missed anything all those years ago. The legal language was clear, more direct than I expected, ownership transferred fully to me, not shared, not conditional, not something that could be easily folded into the neat arrangements Daniel and Vanessa had created for everything else. I paused, letting that realization settle, feeling it move through me in a way that was different from the quiet resignation I had carried these past few days. This was not loss. This was something else entirely, something steady, something that did not need to be taken back because it had never been given away in the first place. I folded the document carefully along its original lines and placed it back into the envelope, smoothing the edges with my fingertips as if restoring something that had simply been waiting to be remembered. The next morning I woke before sunrise, the sky outside still a soft gray, and for the first time since that dinner, I did not hesitate. I dressed slowly, deliberately, choosing clothes that felt like mine, not just things I happened to wear, and I gathered the envelope along with my keys, stepping quietly through the hallway that no longer echoed with the same meaning it once held. When I reached the front door, I paused, listening. The house was still, Vanessa's door closed, Daniel's footsteps absent, and for a moment I stood there, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, recognizing that this was the first step I had taken that was entirely my own in a very long time. The drive took longer than I remembered, nearly an hour past the edges of the city, where the roads narrowed and the buildings gave way to open land, the kind of space that feels both empty and full at the same time. And when I finally turned onto the familiar dirt road, I felt something shift again, not sharply, but with a quiet certainty that settled deeper than anything else had. The farm came into view slowly, the old wooden fence still standing in uneven lines, the barn weathered but intact, the field stretching out beyond it in wide, uninterrupted rows. It was not polished, not modern, not the kind of place Vanessa would ever consider valuable. And yet, as I stepped out of the car and closed the door behind me, I realized that none of that mattered. I walked forward slowly, my shoes pressing into the dry earth, the air carrying that familiar scent of soil and grass that I had not noticed in years, and I stood there, looking out across the land my father had once stood on, remembering the way he used to talk about it, not as property, not as something to sell or manage, but as something that endured, something that stayed. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope again, holding it lightly now, not because it weighed less, but because I understood it differently. And as I looked around, taking in the quiet, the space, the distance from everything that had been taken from me, I began to see not just what this place was, but what it could be. And for the first time since everything had changed, I felt something that was not quiet at all, something steady and certain, something that did not need permission to exist, because while they had been rearranging my life into something smaller, something more manageable for them, they had never once looked beyond it, never once asked what existed outside the boundaries they had drawn. And standing there now, I realized that the one thing they had overlooked was not just a piece of land. It was the part of my life that had never belonged to them and never would. I did not rush back home after that, not immediately. Instead, I stayed a while longer, walking slowly along the edge of the field, letting each step settle into something real, something grounded, because for the first time in days, I was not reacting to what had been taken from me. I was choosing what came next, and that difference mattered more than I expected. I pulled out my phone and searched for a number I had not used in years. The contact still saved under a name that felt distant and familiar at the same time. Mr. Caldwell, my father's old attorney, or at least the firm he had once worked with. I hesitated for only a second before pressing call, listening to the steady ringing as I watched the wind move gently across the tall grass in front of me. When someone finally answered, their voice was younger than I anticipated, professional, efficient, and I explained my name, my father's name, the property, the documents I had in my possession. There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that signals recognition, not confusion, and then the tone shifted slightly, more attentive, more careful, as if I had just stepped into a conversation that had been waiting to happen. They asked me to come in, to bring everything I had, and I agreed without hesitation. The drive back into town felt different this time, not because the road had changed, but because I had. The house came into view as it always did, neat, controlled, exactly the way Vanessa preferred, and when I stepped inside, nothing looked different, but I noticed everything. The arrangement of the furniture, the way my presence barely registered, the quiet assumption that I would continue to move around the edges of a life that no longer included me. Vanessa glanced up briefly from the kitchen, offering a small, polite nod before returning to whatever she was doing. Daniel was not home yet, and I realized that this worked in my favor. I moved through the house calmly, not touching anything I did not need, not drawing attention to myself, because there was nothing to confront, not yet. That evening, I sat at the small desk in the guest room, organizing the documents, reading them again, not out of doubt, but out of preparation, understanding each detail, each line, each implication, because I knew that whatever came next would require more than quiet endurance. It would require clarity. The next morning I drove into town early, arriving at the law office just as they opened. The building itself was modest, nothing like the polished spaces Vanessa admired, but there was something reassuring about its simplicity, something that reminded me of my father, steady, unpretentious, focused on what mattered. The man who greeted me introduced himself as Mr. Caldwell's successor, and when I handed him the envelope, I watched his expression carefully as he read, not for approval, but for confirmation, and I saw it, that subtle shift, the same one I had felt days ago, recognition, understanding, and something else beneath it, something closer to respect. He asked a few questions, precise, direct, and I answered them just as clearly. And when he finally set the papers down, he looked at me in a way no one had in a long time, not as someone to be managed or accommodated, but as someone who held something of value, something real. "Do they know about this?" he asked, and I shook my head once, slowly, because I already knew the answer. They had never asked, and as I sat there, in that quiet office, I realized that everything they had done, every decision, every assumption, had been built on what they thought they understood, and for the first time since that dinner, I allowed myself a small, steady breath, because I knew something they did not, and this time, I was not going to give it away so easily. When I returned home that afternoon, nothing seemed different on the surface. The same quiet hallway, the same carefully arranged furniture, the same low hum of a house that no longer included me. But I noticed something else now, something I had not allowed myself to see before, the confidence in the way Vanessa moved through the space, the assumption in every small gesture that everything here belonged to her now. And in a way, she believed it did. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, his laptop open, papers spread out in front of him, numbers and documents that once would have included me, now arranged without my knowledge. He looked up briefly, offering a small nod. "You were out early," he said, his tone casual, but there was a hint of curiosity beneath it. I placed my bag gently on the counter, taking my time before answering. "I had some things to take care of," I said, keeping my voice even, giving him nothing more than he had given me. He hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to ask more, but Vanessa entered the room before he could, her presence shifting the atmosphere instantly. "We were actually talking about next steps," she said, her voice smooth, controlled, the same tone she used when presenting decisions that were already made, not discussed. I turned slightly to face her, waiting. "It might be best if you started looking at other arrangements," she continued, her expression polite, almost sympathetic, "something smaller, easier to manage, maybe a senior community where you can have support." The words were carefully chosen, wrapped in concern, but the meaning was clear. I nodded once, slowly, as if I had expected this, as if it had already been decided somewhere inside me long before she said it out loud. "That makes sense," I replied, and for the first time since this began, I saw something flicker in her expression, not surprise exactly, but a brief moment of uncertainty, as if she had expected resistance, emotion, something she could respond to, but I gave her none of that. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes moving between us, searching for something that was no longer there. "We just want what is best for you," he added, his voice softer now, almost rehearsed. I looked at him then, really looked, and for a moment, I saw that same distance again. But this time, it did not affect me the way it had before, because I understood something now that I had not understood then. This was not a conversation about what was best for me. It was about what was convenient for them, and I no longer needed to argue that point. "I will take care of it," I said simply, turning away before either of them could say more, because there was nothing left to discuss. That evening I returned to the guest room and began packing what little I had brought with me, folding each item carefully, placing it into a single suitcase, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I was choosing to leave on my own terms, not theirs. Every movement felt deliberate, steady, controlled, not rushed, not emotional, just clear, and as I zipped the suitcase closed, I realized that for the first time since that dinner, I was not being pushed out, I was stepping away, and that difference changed everything. Downstairs I could hear their voices again, low, distant, continuing a conversation that no longer included me. But this time, I did not pause to listen. I did not wonder what they were saying, because it no longer mattered. I had already heard enough, and as I sat down on the edge of the bed, the envelope resting quietly beside me, I felt that same steady certainty settle in once more, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because while they believed they were closing a chapter, I knew something they did not. This was only the beginning. The next morning, I did not wait for anyone to wake up. I did not leave a note. I did not pause at the doorway the way I had the day before. I simply took my suitcase, the same one I had used years ago for trips that felt like something to look forward to, and walked out of the house without looking back. The air outside was cool, still carrying the quiet of early morning. And for a moment, I stood by the car, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, recognizing that this was not an ending. It was a transition. I placed the suitcase in the trunk, settled into the driver's seat, and drove away, not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily, the same way I had done everything else these past few days. The road to town felt shorter this time, familiar in a way that made everything else seem distant, and when I arrived at the law office, Mr. Caldwell was already waiting, his expression calm, prepared, as if he understood the weight of what was about to happen without needing it explained. We sat across from each other in that same quiet office, the documents laid out neatly between us, and he began to speak, outlining details I had not fully considered before. The land had been appraised recently, he explained, not because of anything I had done, but because of growing interest in the area, development plans, expanding infrastructure, things that had quietly increased the value of what had once been dismissed as just an old farm. I listened carefully, not reacting outwardly, but feeling each word settle into place, because with every detail, the picture became clearer, more defined. What I held was not just a piece of land. It was leverage. It was independence. It was something they had never accounted for. If you choose to proceed, he said, his tone measured, respectful, we can begin transferring certain protections immediately, ensuring that everything remains solely under your control. I nodded once, not because I needed time to think, but because I had already made my decision the moment I opened that envelope. Do it, I said simply, and there was no hesitation in my voice, no uncertainty, just clarity, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to question. The process began that same day, signatures, verifications, steps that felt familiar now, but this time, they were mine, not guided by someone else's explanation, not rushed under the promise of convenience. Every line I read, every document I signed, I understood completely, and when it was done, I sat back in the chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, feeling that same steady certainty settle in once more, not as a reaction, but as a foundation. Later that afternoon, as I stepped outside the office, the sunlight felt different, warmer somehow, not because the weather had changed, but because I stood there. For a moment, looking out at the street, people moving through their own lives, unaware of the shift that had just taken place in mine, and I realized something then, something simple but undeniable. They had believed control was about possession, about names on documents, about who held the keys to the house, but they had been wrong, because control was never about what they took, it was about what they failed to see. And as I reached into my bag, feeling the envelope now resting beside a new set of documents, I allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile, not because I needed to prove anything, but because for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where I stood, and more importantly, I knew exactly what they had missed. 3 days later, I returned to the house, not to stay, not to reclaim anything, but to finish what had already been set in motion. The driveway looked the same, the curtains still drawn just the way Vanessa liked them, the illusion of order still perfectly intact. I stepped inside without knocking. My key still worked, though I suspected not for much longer. Daniel was in the living room, his expression shifting the moment he saw me. Surprise first, then something closer to uncertainty. "Mom," he said, standing up quickly, as if unsure whether he should be relieved or concerned. Vanessa appeared a moment later, her posture straight, composed, but I noticed the way her eyes moved, calculating, trying to understand why I had come back without warning. I placed my bag gently on the table, not sitting down, not settling in, just standing there, present, steady. "I came to let you know I will not be needing any arrangements," I said, my voice calm, even, the same tone I had used all along. But this time, it carried something different, something they had not heard before. Daniel frowned slightly, confusion settling across his face. "What do you mean?" he asked, and for a moment, I simply looked at him, not with anger, not with disappointment, just with clarity. "I mean, I have already taken care of everything," I replied, And I saw it then, that brief flicker again, the same one Vanessa had shown before. Uncertainty, not because they did not understand the words, but because they did not understand how. Vanessa stepped forward slightly, her voice still controlled, but sharper now. "Taken care of what?" she asked, and I reached into my bag, pulling out the folder, placing it carefully on the table between us, not pushing it toward them, not offering it, just letting it exist there, visible, undeniable. Daniel hesitated before picking it up, flipping through the pages quickly at first, then more slowly, his expression changing with each line, confusion giving way to something else, something heavier, something closer to realization. Vanessa leaned in, reading over his shoulder, her composure slipping just enough to reveal what she had been holding back, not fear, but the awareness that something had shifted beyond her control. I said nothing while they read. I did not need to explain. The documents spoke clearly enough. The ownership, the value, the protections that had already been put in place, everything they had overlooked, everything they had dismissed as irrelevant, laid out in a way that could not be ignored. Daniel looked up finally, his voice quieter now. "Why did you not tell us about this?" he asked, and for a moment the question lingered in the air, not as an accusation, but as something closer to regret. I held his gaze, steady, unwavering. "You never asked," I said simply, and that was the truth, not bitter, not dramatic, just clear. Vanessa straightened, her expression tightening as she processed what this meant, the careful balance she had built, the control she believed she had secured, all of it now resting on something she had never considered. I reached for my bag, lifting it from the table, my movements unhurried, deliberate. "I will be leaving today," I added, not as a request, not as a discussion, but as a statement. Daniel took a step forward, as if he wanted to say something else, something that might change the direction of this moment. But no words came, and I did not wait for them. I turned and walked toward the door, the same path I had taken so many times before. But this time, it felt different, not because the house had changed, but because I had. And as I stepped outside, closing the door behind me without looking back, I understood something that had taken me far too long to see. They had taken everything they believed defined my life, the house, the money, the space I once occupied, but they had missed the one thing that was never theirs to take. And in the end, that was the only thing that truly mattered.